It was late in the afternoon when the sun hung low and golden over the quiet stretch of highway outside the city. The road curved gently through the hills, with fields on either side turning soft shades of orange and brown. The hum of traffic was light, just a few cars passing every couple of minutes. In one of those cars sat a man driving calmly, the windows rolled down enough for the breeze to brush through. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't breaking any law. He was simply heading to a meeting, mind clear and focused. He'd done this drive dozens of times before, always taking the same route, always keeping to the speed limit. The radio played soft jazz, and for a moment he felt at peace. He had no idea his next few minutes would change lives, his and someone else's, forever. Behind him, a patrol car appeared. Its white and blue lights flashed once, then again. At first, the man thought the officer was chasing someone else. But when the siren gave a sharp burst and the car swerved closer, he realized it was meant for him. His hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Confusion flickered in his eyes. He checked his speed, well below the limit. His seatbelt was fastened and the car registration was current. He couldn't think of a single reason for being stopped. Still, he did exactly what a careful citizen should do. He pulled over smoothly onto the shoulder, put the car in park, and waited. The jazz music faded out as he turned off the radio. He sat quietly, breathing slowly. Through his rearview mirror, he saw the patrol car door open and a uniformed officer step out. The man's stride was stiff, confident, almost aggressive. He adjusted his belt, rested one hand on his holster, and walked toward the driver's window. The officer didn't smile or greet him. "License and registration," he said flatly. His tone wasn't neutral. It carried a kind of edge, as though suspicion was already formed. The driver nodded politely. "Of course, officer," he said in a calm voice. He reached carefully for his wallet, making sure his hand stayed visible. He knew how quickly a simple movement could be misread. As he handed over his license, he asked softly, "May I know what the reason for the stop is?" The officer looked at him for a long second, eyes scanning the car, the suit jacket draped over the passenger seat, the briefcase near the console. "You were driving a little slow back there," he finally said. "Also, I didn't recognize the car. We've had some reports of vehicles like this being used in suspicious activity." The man blinked, puzzled. "Suspicious activity?" he repeated. "I'm not sure I understand." "This is my personal car." The officer's gaze lingered, unimpressed. "Maybe, but I'll need to check everything." He looked again at the luxury car, polished, new, clearly expensive. "Mind stepping out for me?" The driver hesitated just a moment, then nodded. "Sure, no problem." He unbuckled his seatbelt, opened the door slowly, and stepped out onto the gravel. The air was warm and still, but the situation carried a chill. The officer circled the vehicle slowly, glancing at the plates, peering through the windows. "Where are you headed in such a hurry?" he asked. "I'm not in a hurry," the man said quietly. "Just on my way to a meeting in the city." "What kind of meeting?" "It's a professional meeting, state business." That answer didn't seem to please the officer. He frowned slightly, the suspicion in his eyes deepening. "State business, huh? That's vague. You got any proof of that?" The man smiled politely. "I'm not sure what kind of proof you'd like. But I have my identification and I'm happy to cooperate." "Yeah, we'll see about that," the officer muttered. The man stood calmly beside his car, trying not to let the unease show. He'd dealt with tense situations before, but there was something different here, something unnecessary in the officer's tone. The balance of power in that moment felt unfair, tilted by assumptions he could feel but not name. Cars passed by slowly. A few drivers glancing curiously at the sight of a well-dressed man standing beside a shiny sedan, while an officer questioned him. The man's mind raced briefly. Should he mention who he was? Should he call someone? No, not yet, he decided. Let the situation play out. He didn't want to seem defensive. The officer returned from his car after running the license and registration. Everything checked out, but he still didn't hand the documents back. "You sure this is your car?" he asked again, almost accusingly. "Yes," the man said patiently. "My name should match the registration." "It does," the officer admitted, though he didn't sound satisfied. "Just making sure." The man nodded once, his composure unbroken. "I understand," but the officer wasn't done. "Mind if I take a quick look inside the car?" The question came like a challenge. The man knew his rights. There was no cause, no visible reason for a search. But refusing might make things worse. He took a breath. "Officer," he said carefully, "I'd prefer not to consent to a search without a reason. I believe everything's in order." The officer's jaw tightened. "So you're refusing?" "I'm just asking for clarification," the man said evenly. The silence stretched. The officer's hand rested near his belt again, not as a threat but as a show of control. The man felt his heartbeat rise, though he kept his face calm. Inside, he couldn't help but wonder, what did I do to deserve this suspicion? After a long pause, the officer sighed, walked back to his patrol car, and started speaking into the radio. The man couldn't hear the exact words, but he caught bits and pieces, phrases like possible match and requesting backup. His stomach tightened. Backup for what? A few minutes later, another patrol car appeared in the distance, its lights flashing lazily. The man looked down the road, then back at the first officer. This had gone from strange to serious. The second officer stepped out and greeted the first with a short nod. They spoke quietly for a moment, glancing occasionally at the man in his car. The second officer's face looked uncertain, almost uneasy. The first seemed determined to prove something that didn't exist. When the first officer finally turned back toward the man, he said sharply, "I need you to stand over here by the front of the vehicle." "Am I being detained?" the man asked softly. "For now, yes. Until we sort this out," he didn't argue. He walked to the front of the car and stood still, hands visible, posture calm. The gravel crunched under his shoes. The sky had started to dim, a soft gray replacing the bright gold. It felt like the day itself was holding its breath. The officers checked the trunk area, peeked through the windows again, ran the plates twice. The second officer finally turned toward the man and asked quietly, "Sir, may I ask what you do for a living?" He gave a small smile. "I work in law enforcement," he said simply. That answer stopped the second officer short. He blinked. "You do?" "Yes, I'm with the State Department." The first officer looked back sharply. "You're saying you're in law enforcement?" "That's correct." The silence that followed was thick. The first officer looked suddenly less confident. His face shifted as if processing something he hadn't expected. But instead of apologizing, he simply muttered, "We'll verify that." The man nodded. "Please do." Inside, though, a small ache grew. Not anger, just disappointment. He'd dedicated years to making law enforcement more fair, more professional, more accountable. Yet here he was, standing on the side of a road treated like a suspect for no reason other than someone's assumptions. The radio crackled again in the first officer's car. He walked quickly to listen, glancing between the message and the man. His expression changed, a mix of disbelief and dawning realization. The second officer looked at him confused. "Everything okay?" he asked. The first officer didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the man for a long moment, as if the truth had finally hit him harder than any reprimand could. The man didn't move, didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He stood silently, waiting. At last, the officer walked back over and handed him his documents. "You're free to go," he said in a clipped tone. The man took them, gave a polite nod, and said softly, "Thank you." Then he returned to his car, opened the door, and sat down. His hands rested on the wheel for a moment before he started the engine. He took one slow breath, then pulled back onto the road, leaving the flashing lights behind. For a few miles, the drive was quiet again, but it didn't feel peaceful anymore. The air was heavy with what had just happened. Still, he reminded himself to stay calm. There would be time to address this properly, soon. For now, he just focused on the road ahead, steady and sure, determined not to let one person's prejudice define the rest of his day. What he didn't know was that this small encounter, this simple 5-minute stop, was already setting something much bigger in motion, something that would shake the department before the evening was over. The man drove for a while in silence after the traffic stop, letting the steady rhythm of the tires calm his nerves. The wind moved gently through the open window, carrying the faint scent of pine from the trees that lined the highway. He tried to shake off the unease that lingered, but his mind replayed the scene over and over. The way the officer had looked at him, the suspicion in his voice, the sharpness in his tone. It wasn't new, but it still stung every time. He wasn't angry. Anger, he'd learned long ago, only gave power to the wrong people. What he felt instead was disappointment. He believed deeply in law enforcement and what it could be when done right. fair, honest, respectful. But moments like this reminded him how far there still was to go. As he approached the city limits, he glanced at the clock. He was running a few minutes late for his meeting. Normally that would bother him, but today, he just wanted to arrive safely and clear his head. The meeting was with regional law enforcement leaders, a discussion about community relations, bias training, and accountability. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had just lived through the very issue they were gathering to address. When he finally reached the state building downtown, he parked in his reserved spot and stepped out. The guard at the entrance greeted him with a respectful nod. "Good afternoon, sir," the guard said. "You're right on time." "Afternoon," the man replied, managing a small smile. He straightened his tie and walked through the glass doors. The building's air conditioning cooled the last bit of tension from his shoulders. Inside, the quiet hum of conversation filled the hallway. Upstairs, a handful of senior officers and administrators were already gathered around a conference table. As he entered, they stood briefly, acknowledging his presence. He was their director, the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the state. Calm and composed as always, he took his seat at the head of the table. "Sorry for the slight delay," he said, setting his briefcase down. "Got held up on the way here." "No worries," one of the deputies said. "We were just getting started." He nodded, glancing at the agenda. But before they could begin, his phone buzzed quietly on the table. He looked at the caller ID and noticed it was the regional police chief, the same jurisdiction where he'd been pulled over. The timing caught his attention. He excused himself from the meeting and stepped into the hallway to take the call. "Chief," he said evenly, "good to hear from you." The voice on the other end sounded cautious, almost uneasy. "Sir, I believe we need to talk. Something's come up and I think you should hear it from me." The man leaned against the wall, calm but curious. "Go ahead." "Well," the chief began, clearing his throat. "One of my officers conducted a traffic stop earlier this afternoon. The driver was you." There was a pause. The man said nothing. He wanted to see where the chief would go with this. The chief continued, voice lower now. "I've already reviewed the dashcam footage. I don't have to tell you how bad it looks. I'm on my way to the precinct right now. That kind of behavior doesn't represent this department." The man exhaled slowly. "I appreciate that, Chief. Let's handle it properly." "I'll trust your judgment on the next steps." "Yes, sir," the chief said firmly. "We'll address it immediately." When the call ended, the man slipped his phone back into his pocket and returned to the meeting. But his thoughts drifted. He didn't want revenge or to make a scene. He wanted accountability, fairness. The young officer needed to understand what he'd done, not just to him, but to the trust between officers and the people they serve. Back at the suburban precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officer Keller sat in the small report room, tapping his fingers nervously against the desk. His partner, who had arrived midway through the stop, sat across from him silent. Word had spread quickly. Something big was happening. Keller's face was pale. He hadn't expected the man he detained to be anyone important. He thought he was just another driver giving vague answers. Now he knew the truth. The man was not just anyone. He was the director of law enforcement for the entire state. The man who oversaw every department, every policy, every badge. The door opened and the police chief walked in. His expression was unreadable. He closed the door quietly behind him, and for a long moment no one spoke. The sound of the air conditioner filled the silence. "Officer Keller," the chief said finally, his voice steady but cold. "Do you understand what you've done today?" Keller swallowed hard. "Sir, I was just doing my job." "I made a routine stop." "Routine?" the chief interrupted. "You detained a man without probable cause. You escalated a situation that didn't require escalation. You called for backup without justification. And the man you detained, your superior officer's superior, was calm and compliant the entire time." Keller shifted in his seat. He said he worked for the state, but I didn't believe him." "People say that all the time." The chief's jaw tightened. "Then you verify it. You don't detain them like a criminal. Did you see how you spoke to him on camera? The tone, the assumption? I didn't mean any disrespect, sir. I just thought—" "That's the problem," the chief cut in sharply. "You thought. You assumed. You profiled a man for no reason other than your own bias, and you did it wearing this badge." He pointed to the badge pinned on Keller's chest. "This department does not tolerate that." Keller looked down, shame creeping across his face. "I wasn't trying to be unfair. Intent doesn't erase the impact," the chief said. His voice softened slightly but remained firm. You embarrassed this department, and worse, you damaged public trust. Do you realize what could have happened if he wasn't who he was? That stop could have gone very differently. The room was still again. Keller didn't answer. The chief turned toward the second officer, who had remained mostly silent. You tried to de-escalate, he said. You asked questions. I appreciate that. You can step out. The second officer nodded, quietly leaving the room. When the door closed, the chief faced Keller again. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending review. Turn in your badge and weapon. Keller's mouth fell open slightly. Sir, please, just let me explain. It was a misunderstanding. I didn't mean, this isn't about what you meant, the chief said, his voice final. It's about what you did. The footage speaks for itself. I can't overlook this, not when the entire state is watching how we handle it. Keller hesitated, then slowly reached for his belt. His hands trembled as he unclipped his badge and placed it on the desk, beside his service weapon. The metallic sound echoed in the small room. The chief looked at him for a moment, his expression softening slightly. You had potential, he said quietly. You're not a bad officer, Keller. But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing people as people. That's what went wrong today. Keller lowered his eyes. What happens now? There'll be a formal investigation, the chief replied. But I can tell you this, your actions have consequences. You'll need to face them. When the chief left the room, Keller sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space where his badge had been. The reality of it hit him slowly, heavier with each passing minute. One decision, one moment of arrogance had cost him everything. Meanwhile, back in the city, the man finished his meeting quietly. He didn't bring up what had happened. The discussion went on as planned, focusing on building trust between officers and the public. But as he spoke about accountability and fairness, his words carried new weight. He wasn't talking theory anymore. He was speaking from fresh experience. After the meeting, one of the senior members approached him in the hallway. Sir, I heard something happened earlier today, he said gently. Are you all right? The man smiled faintly. I'm fine. It's been handled. Do you want to issue a statement? The colleague asked. He shook his head. No need. Let the department handle its own. The lesson will carry further that way. That night, as the city lights glowed against the dark sky, the man sat in his office alone. The phone on his desk buzzed occasionally with updates, emails, messages of apology from officials, even a short note from the police chief himself. He appreciated the gestures, but he wasn't looking for sympathy. What he wanted was change, real, lasting change. One incident couldn't fix years of misunderstanding, but maybe it could start a conversation. He looked out the window at the streets below, thinking of the many people who faced moments like his every day, but without the authority or title to protect them. That thought lingered the longest. The next morning, the story began to spread quietly among law enforcement circles. People talked in break rooms, in patrol cars, in group chats. Some were shocked, others embarrassed. Most agreed on one thing. The man's calm handling of the situation showed the kind of integrity their profession needed more of. At the same time, the young officer who had made the mistake sat alone at home, replaying the dashcam footage in his mind. He could hear his own voice, the arrogance, the assumptions, and for the first time, he understood how it sounded from the other side. It was a hard lesson, but a necessary one, and somewhere in that quiet understanding, the story of a single traffic stop began to turn into something much bigger. A reminder that respect, once lost, can only be rebuilt through humility, truth, and change. The morning after the traffic stop, the air in the city felt heavier than usual. The sun rose over the skyline, painting the glass towers with gold. But inside the law enforcement offices, no one was paying much attention to the beauty outside. The story was spreading faster than anyone expected. It started as a quiet conversation between departments, a story whispered among officers about a traffic stop gone wrong. But by mid-morning, it had reached the state press. An online post mentioned that a local officer had detained a high-ranking law enforcement official during a traffic stop, and that the incident had led to immediate consequences. No names were shared, but everyone knew who it was about. Phones began ringing nonstop. Journalists called for comments. Officers exchanged messages asking if the rumors were true. Even civilians passing through the lobby of the state building could sense the tension. Something had happened, and everyone wanted to know how serious it was. In his office, the man sat quietly behind his desk. Papers were neatly stacked in front of him, but he wasn't reading them. His eyes rested on the city outside his window, the steady hum of traffic far below. He had expected this. News like this never stayed quiet for long. Still, he had hoped it might. He didn't want the situation to turn into a public spectacle. For him, the goal wasn't punishment, it was change. But he also knew that sometimes the two couldn't be separated. A knock came at the door. His assistant stepped in holding a folder. "Sir," she said gently, "the press is asking for a statement. They're saying they'll publish the dashcam details by this afternoon." He looked up slowly. "Have they confirmed the officer's name?" "Not yet," she replied. "But people are guessing." He nodded slightly, then leaned back in his chair. "All right," he said after a moment. "Let's not give them a quote right now. Tell them the department is handling it internally." "Yes, sir." She hesitated for a moment before leaving. "Are you sure you don't want to say something?" He smiled faintly. "Not yet. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words." When she left, he took a slow breath. The truth was, he didn't want to humiliate anyone. He just wanted the truth to guide the lesson. The officer had made a mistake, an ugly one, but public outrage wouldn't fix the deeper issue. It had to be handled with balance. Meanwhile, at the suburban precinct, the chief was in the middle of a storm. Reporters had gathered outside holding microphones and cameras. Officers entering the building kept their heads down, hoping to avoid attention. Inside, the chief stood before a line of his senior staff giving clear instructions. "No one speaks to the media," he said firmly. "Not a word. We'll issue an official statement once the review is completed. Until then, we stay professional." Behind him, Officer Keller sat in a chair against the wall. He hadn't slept much. The sleepless night had left dark circles under his eyes. His badge and weapon were gone, his uniform replaced with plain clothes. He listened silently, feeling smaller with each passing minute. He had spent years building his career, dreaming of becoming a detective one day. Now, in less than 24 hours, it all felt like it was slipping away. After the briefing, the chief called him into his office. The door closed softly behind them. "Sit down," the chief said. Keller obeyed, clasping his hands together tightly. "I've reviewed the full footage again," the chief said, his tone steady but sharp. "And I've spoken to the director personally. Do you have anything you'd like to say before we move forward?" Keller hesitated. His voice came out low and unsure.
"Sir, I didn't mean for any of this to happen."
"I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought something didn't feel right about that car." "I was wrong," the chief nodded slowly. "You were wrong, yes. But more than that, you were careless. You let bias cloud your judgment. You treated a citizen with suspicion for no valid reason. The fact that it was your superior only made it worse, but even if it hadn't been him, the issue would still be serious." Keller's eyes dropped to the floor. "I understand." "I don't think you do," the chief said quietly. "This isn't about bad luck or a misunderstanding. This is about respect. Every time we put on this uniform, we're representing something bigger than ourselves. And when you let your pride get in the way, you tear that down." The chief leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "You're being terminated, Keller. Effective immediately." The words landed like a weight. Keller's breath caught slightly, but he didn't argue. Deep down, he knew there was no saving his position. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I really am." "I hope you are," the chief replied. "Learn from it. That's the only thing that matters now." When Keller left the building, the reporters outside turned toward him instantly. Cameras flashed, voices shouted questions, but he kept his head down and walked quickly to his car. He didn't answer anyone. He just drove away, unsure where he was even going. Inside the city, the man who had been detained kept working as if nothing had happened. But the situation had begun taking on a life of its own. By midday, social media was full of posts. Some people praised the director's calmness, saying his restraint was a masterclass in professionalism. Others criticized the officer's behavior, using it as an example of why trust between police and citizens needed repair. Despite the noise online, the man refused to make it personal. When a journalist cornered him later that afternoon asking for a reaction, he simply said, "We all make mistakes. What matters is how we correct them." Then he walked away, leaving the reporter speechless. His quiet dignity only added to the story's power. That evening, a news program aired a short segment about the incident. The anchor described it as a rare moment of accountability within law enforcement. The dashcam footage, which had been released by the department, showed the officer's overly aggressive tone contrasted with the calm, respectful demeanor of the man he stopped. Viewers across the state saw the clip and reacted instantly. Calls flooded the department's public line, some angry, some supportive. But the overwhelming message was clear. People wanted change. In precincts around the state, officers gathered in break rooms, watching the clip in silence. Many of them felt uncomfortable. Some defended Keller, saying he was under pressure and made a bad call. Others said the footage spoke for itself. But everyone agreed on one thing: it was a wake-up call. The next morning, the man received a call from a longtime colleague, someone he respected deeply. "You know, this thing's gone everywhere," the voice on the line said. "People are talking about it in departments across the state. You've handled it better than anyone could have." He smiled faintly. "It's not about me. It's about the message. If it makes people think, it's worth it. You think it'll change anything? I have to believe it will," he said simply. Later that day, he held a private meeting with his communications team. The department needed to issue an official statement, not about the stop itself, but about the broader issue it represented. He drafted it himself, keeping the tone calm and constructive. It read, "Professionalism in law enforcement means treating every citizen with respect, regardless of background, appearance, or circumstance. Accountability is not a punishment. It is our duty to the public we serve." When the statement was released, it spread quickly. News outlets quoted it, advocacy groups shared it, and even within police departments, officers discussed it in training sessions. Meanwhile, Keller stayed mostly out of sight. He had moved back to his parents' house outside the city, trying to process everything. His phone buzzed with messages from friends, some supportive, some critical, but he ignored most of them. He replayed the footage in his head again and again, hearing his own tone, the arrogance, the misplaced authority. For the first time, he truly saw how it must have felt for the man on the other side of that badge. It wasn't just about one stop anymore. It was about a mindset. Days passed and the noise slowly began to settle. But the conversation it started didn't fade. Departments began revisiting their training programs. Supervisors called for new workshops on communication, empathy, and de-escalation. What had started as a 5-minute mistake was now reshaping policy across the region. One afternoon, the man received an email from a small-town police chief he'd never met. The message was short but sincere. "We showed the video during our morning meeting today. It sparked one of the best discussions we've ever had. Thank you for how you handled it." The man smiled quietly when he read it. That was the outcome he had hoped for. Not scandal or attention, but awareness. He closed his laptop and looked out the window again at the city. The world outside looked the same, but something inside it had shifted, even if only a little. Sometimes real change didn't start with a speech or a policy. Sometimes it started with an uncomfortable moment, one that forced everyone to stop, look in the mirror, and ask themselves who they really were behind the badge. And as he sat there, the man felt a small sense of peace. The road to fairness was long, but that day it had taken one honest step forward. The week after the traffic stop, the city's police department found itself under a brighter spotlight than ever before. For years, people had complained quietly about unfair treatment during stops, about small moments that left lasting scars. But this time, the issue had a face, a respected leader known for fairness and integrity. The irony was too sharp for anyone to ignore. The department's phones rang nonstop. Community groups wanted answers. News outlets wanted interviews. Every officer, from rookies to veterans, felt the pressure. But the man at the center of it all, the director, remained calm. He kept working, kept showing up to meetings, and refused to let the situation turn into personal drama. Meanwhile, the police chief who had fired the officer spent sleepless nights preparing for the inevitable press conference. He knew the world would be watching. The department's reputation depended on how he handled it. Inside his office, he rehearsed his words, not from a script, but from a place of responsibility. He wanted to be honest. The day of the press conference arrived on a gray morning. The air outside was cool, the kind that carries a quiet tension before something important happens. Cameras were already lined up outside the precinct. Reporters gathered in clusters, their microphones ready, their questions sharp. Inside, the chief stood behind a simple podium. His uniform was crisp, his posture steady, but there was weight in his eyes, the weight of leadership during a hard moment. When the room quieted, he spoke. "Good morning," he began. "As many of you know, our department has been under review following a recent traffic stop involving one of our officers and a member of the state's law enforcement leadership. After examining the facts, we took swift and decisive action. The officer involved has been terminated, effective immediately." The reporter scribbled notes quickly. Cameras flashed. The chief continued, his tone serious but sincere. "I want to be clear, this is not about politics or pressure. This is about accountability. We are public servants. We answer to the people, and when one of us fails to uphold that trust, we must respond accordingly." He paused, letting the room absorb his words. The director showed professionalism and restraint during the incident. He did not use his position to demand special treatment. Instead, he let the process work, and that speaks to his character. As for our department, we will take this moment to listen, learn, and rebuild trust. One of the reporters raised a hand. "Chief, do you believe this was an isolated mistake or part of a bigger problem?" The chief took a slow breath before answering. "I think moments like this show us that it's not about one person. It's about a system that needs constant reflection. We're starting new training programs immediately, focused on communication, empathy, and recognizing unconscious bias. It's not enough to say we serve the community. We have to prove it every day." His words were honest, not rehearsed, and that's what made them powerful. When the press conference ended, the footage spread quickly online. People praised the chief's candor. Others were skeptical, saying words were easy but change was harder. Still, for the first time in a while, there was a feeling of movement, a sense that maybe, just maybe, someone was finally listening. Later that afternoon, the director watched the recording from his office. He didn't smile, but there was quiet respect in his eyes. The chief had handled it well, not defensively, not dismissively. That gave him hope. A few minutes later, his assistant walked in holding a folder. "Sir, we've been getting calls from different departments," she said. "They're asking if you'd be willing to speak about the incident at the upcoming leadership conference." He looked thoughtful. "Do you think it's wise?" "I think people want to hear from you," she said softly. "Not about what happened, but about what it means." He nodded slowly. "All right, let's do it." The day of the conference arrived a few days later. It was held in a large hall filled with officers from across the state, men and women of all ranks, wearing uniforms that represented different towns but the same purpose. The atmosphere was respectful but curious. Everyone had heard about the incident. Now they were here to hear from the man himself. When the director stepped onto the stage, the room grew silent. He didn't use a teleprompter or a stack of notes. He simply looked at the crowd and spoke from the heart. "Most of you know why we're here," he began. "And yes, some of you already know what happened to me last week. But this isn't about me or one officer. This is about something bigger. How we treat people, how we see them, and how easy it is to forget the power we hold when we wear this badge." He let that thought settle before continuing. "I wasn't angry that day. I was disappointed. Disappointed because the job we do is built on trust, and that trust begins with respect. When an officer stops a driver, that moment becomes a test of character for both people involved." Some in the audience nodded quietly. "I've been in this profession for more than 20 years, he continued. "I've seen what happens when officers act out of fear instead of understanding. I've also seen what happens when they choose compassion. The difference is everything." He paused, then added gently, "We can have all the training in the world, but if we forget that every person we meet has a story, then we've already failed." The room stayed quiet. His tone wasn't angry or accusing. It was calm, reflective, deeply human. "I'm not here to criticize," he said. "I'm here to remind us that we can do better. And doing better doesn't make us weak. It makes us worthy of the trust people give us every day." When he finished, the hall erupted into applause. It wasn't loud or wild, but it was sincere. Officers stood clapping slowly, their faces thoughtful. Many of them would leave that room and think differently about the next person they stopped, the next word they spoke, the next decision they made. After the event, several officers approached him privately to thank him. One young sergeant said, "Sir, I used to think calmness meant weakness. Now I see it's the opposite." The director smiled warmly. "It takes strength to stay calm," he said, "and strength to admit we can learn." That evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, the director sat alone in his office again. A small notebook lay open in front of him, filled with scribbled notes, ideas for new training programs, ways to bring community members into discussions, plans to create more transparency and officer conduct reviews. He believed change started with conversation, but it couldn't stop there. It needed to be built into the foundation of the system itself. Outside his window, the lights of the city flickered on one by one. Down on the streets, people walked home from work, unaware of how one brief traffic stop was quietly reshaping the culture of law enforcement across their state. At the same time, the former officer sat in his apartment watching the news. He saw the director's speech replayed in clips online. The words hit him harder than any punishment could have. It wasn't bitterness in the director's tone, it was truth. And for the first time, Keller truly understood the damage his actions had caused. He closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "I should have listened." In the days that followed, the director's message began to ripple outward. Departments started holding open forums with community members. Officers attended empathy workshops and bias discussions that were usually dismissed as just training. But this time, it felt different. The message had come from one of their own, someone who understood their challenges, their pride, their fears. It wasn't a revolution. It wasn't overnight change, but it was real progress. Weeks later, the director received a letter in the mail. It had no return address, just neat handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a single page. The words were simple. "Thank you for how you handled everything. I've learned more from this mistake than I ever did in training. I hope one day I can earn back the respect I lost." There was no signature, but he didn't need one. He knew exactly who it was from. He read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the top drawer of his desk. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Change begins when someone chooses humility over pride. He looked out the window one last time that night. The city was quiet. The streets were calm, and for the first time since that stop on the highway, he felt that maybe, just maybe, something good had come from it all. The weeks that followed felt like a quiet turning point for everyone involved. The story of the traffic stop had faded from the headlines, but its echo remained inside the department and beyond. People were talking, really talking about what it meant to wear a uniform, to hold authority, and to be accountable. Inside the state's law enforcement headquarters, the director had made it his mission not to let the moment fade into just another story. He wanted it to become a lesson, a reason for change. He believed that the best way to fix something broken was not to blame, but to rebuild with honesty. One Monday morning, he sat in a conference room with a small group of training officers and community representatives. The air smelled of coffee and paper. Charts and notes were spread across the table. Everyone looked a little tired but focused. "Let's talk about what comes next," he said calmly. "I don't want this to be another policy that gathers dust in a folder. I want people to feel the difference on the streets." A middle-aged officer with years of field experience spoke up. "Sir, people think we don't care, but most of us do. We just don't know how to talk about these things. Sometimes training feels too formal. It doesn't reach us where it matters." The director nodded. "Then we change how we train. We focus on people, not just procedures." A woman from a local community group leaned forward. "If you're serious about that, we can help. Let people from the community be part of your workshops." Not as guests, but as teachers. Everyone looked at her. It was an idea that made sense, yet it wasn't something police departments had often done. The director smiled. "That's exactly the kind of change we need." Over the next few weeks, they built a new program, one that combined standard training with real stories. Instead of lectures, there were conversations. Officers sat across from community members and listened. Some sessions were uncomfortable, but they were real. One evening, in a small auditorium, a young man stood up during one of these sessions. "When I get pulled over," he said quietly, "I get scared. Not because I've done something wrong, but because I don't know what's going to happen. I wish I could trust that the person coming up to my window sees me as a human being first." No one spoke for a moment. Then an officer, a father of 3, replied softly, "I get scared too sometimes. Not of you, but of making the wrong move, saying the wrong thing. Maybe if we both saw that fear in each other, we could start with understanding." That moment changed the room. For the first time, it felt like people were on the same side. News of these workshops started spreading. Departments from other cities reached out to ask how they could do the same. The director was invited to speak again, but he refused to make it about publicity. He wanted the focus to stay on action. He often reminded his team, if we spend more time listening than defending, we'll find solutions faster. One afternoon, as he walked through the halls of the academy, he overheard a group of new recruits talking. They were discussing the incident not with mockery or fear, but curiosity. One said, "I think the lesson is simple. Respect is part of the uniform." The director smiled to himself. That single sentence was worth every effort. Meanwhile, the former officer who had been fired kept to himself. He had moved away from town, trying to rebuild his life quietly. The guilt of what happened stayed with him. It wasn't something he could shake off. Every time he saw a patrol car drive by, it reminded him of what he lost. Not just a job, but his sense of integrity. He started volunteering at a local youth center, trying to do something good with his time. He never talked about his past, but he listened to others. Over time, helping people began to ease the weight on his shoulders. Back at headquarters, the director received another report, this time from one of the regional precincts. Complaints about officer behavior had dropped noticeably in just 2 months. Community meetings were filled with cautious optimism instead of anger. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One evening, he decided to visit a small town station unannounced. When he walked in, the officers there were surprised. He greeted them warmly and asked how they were finding the new training sessions. A young officer smiled and said, "At first I thought it was just another box to check off. But now I see things differently. Last week I pulled over a driver, and instead of starting with demands, I started with a simple, 'Good evening, sir, how's your day going?' The whole tone changed. No tension, no attitude, just respect." The director nodded, clearly proud. "That's how change begins," he said. Small choices that make big differences. As he drove back to the city that night, the quiet highway stretched before him, the same kind of road where everything had started. He thought about how strange life could be, how something painful could lead to something good if handled with patience. When he got home, he found a message on his phone from the police chief. "We're seeing real improvement. Thank you for leading by example." He didn't reply immediately. He just sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. A few days later, the director attended a public town hall meeting. The room was packed. People from all backgrounds showed up. Officers, teachers, parents, students. The air buzzed with energy. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't bring notes. He simply said, "The badge we wear doesn't give us power, it gives us duty. A duty to be fair, patient, and kind. A duty to protect without prejudice, and that duty begins the moment we open our mouths, not just when we draw our weapons." He looked around the room, meeting people's eyes. "We're not perfect. We make mistakes. But the goal isn't perfection, it's progress. Every time we choose respect, we're one step closer to trust." A woman from the back of the room stood up. "Do you think change like this can last?" she asked. He smiled gently. "Only if we keep working for it." Change doesn't come from headlines. It comes from habits. The crowd applauded softly, not out of excitement, but agreement. After the meeting, a young girl approached him. She couldn't have been more than 12. "My dad's a police officer," she said. "He told me he's trying to be better because of what you said." He bent slightly to meet her eyes. "Tell him I'm proud of him," he said warmly. "And tell him you should be too." That night, as he drove home, he felt a quiet peace. The road ahead was long, but he wasn't walking it alone anymore. The department was changing, not through punishment or fear, but through understanding and heart. In his office the next morning, he found a package on his desk. Inside was a framed photograph from the last training session. It showed officers and community members sitting together in a circle, laughing over coffee. On the back of the frame was a handwritten note. "This is what progress looks like. Thank you for helping us see it." He placed the frame on his desk where the sunlight hit it every morning. Whenever the days got hard, he looked at it and reminded himself why he had chosen this work. The past couldn't be changed, but the future could be shaped, and that was enough. For the first time in a long time, he felt that something truly meaningful had come out of a painful moment. People were learning, talking, and healing. And maybe that was the best kind of justice, one that didn't come from punishment, but from growth. He leaned back in his chair, looking out the window at the city below. The world wasn't perfect, but today it felt just a little bit better. And that was a start. Months had passed since that unforgettable traffic stop that changed everything. Life had moved on for most people. But for those who had lived it up close, its lessons remained alive every single day. Inside the department, the air felt different. Officers carried themselves with more awareness. Conversations that once felt impossible now happened openly. The director's steady approach had quietly turned a painful mistake into a movement of growth. It was early morning when he arrived at his office, coffee in hand, greeted by the soft hum of activity in the building. Officers passed by with polite nods, and every greeting carried a subtle warmth, something that hadn't always been there before. He had always believed that change doesn't come through shouting or shaming. It comes through patience, persistence, and example. He sat at his desk and opened a file filled with updates from various precincts. As he read through the pages, he couldn't help but feel proud. Reports showed a steady drop in complaints, a rise in positive community feedback, and more officers attending empathy workshops voluntarily. Some even started visiting local schools to talk with kids about respect, safety, and understanding the law. He smiled, thinking, "This is how we rebuild trust, not with rules, but with hearts." Later that day, he was invited to speak at a statewide summit on law enforcement ethics. He hadn't planned on going at first, but his assistant insisted. "People need to hear your story," she said. "They need to see what's possible." He finally agreed. The event took place in the capital's largest civic hall, filled with leaders, community figures, and police representatives from across the state. The energy in the room was hopeful but heavy. Everyone knew how fragile progress could be. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't walk to the podium as an authority figure, but as a man who had experienced something deeply personal. He stood tall yet humble, his voice calm and clear. "I'm not here to talk about policy today," he began. "I'm here to talk about people. A while back, I found myself in a moment that could have gone very differently, but instead of reacting with anger, I chose patience. I chose to let the system do its work. And because of that choice, we are all standing in a better place today." The room was silent. Every word carried the weight of truth. He went on. "We all wear titles, officer, director, leader, but before anything else, we are human. When we forget that, we lose the very thing we're supposed to protect." He looked around the hall, meeting eyes across the crowd. "We don't build trust by demanding it. We build it by earning it. And the way we earn it is simple. By treating others the way we'd want to be treated, if the roles were reversed." There was a quiet murmur of agreement. He shared stories from the new training programs, moments of understanding between officers and citizens, times when small acts of kindness turned tense situations into peaceful ones. "It's not about perfection," he said softly. "It's about presence, about remembering that every encounter is a chance to do better than we did yesterday." When he finished, the applause was long but gentle. People stood not just out of respect but out of gratitude. It wasn't a speech to impress. It was a message that reached their hearts. After the event, several people came up to thank him. One older man, a retired officer, shook his hand firmly. "You made me proud to wear the badge again," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for reminding us why we started this job in the first place." The director smiled. "That means more than you know," he said quietly. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the city in gold, he walked to his car slowly, breathing in the crisp air. It was one of those calm moments when the world felt balanced. But just as he reached his car, he noticed someone standing nearby, a man in plain clothes waiting nervously. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice hesitant. The director turned, curious. The man stepped closer, holding something in his hands. It was a small envelope. "I don't know if you remember me," he said, his tone soft. "But I'm the officer you stopped that day." For a moment, time seemed to pause. The director looked at him, recognizing the face. Older now, more tired, but different somehow. The man's eyes carried humility instead of arrogance. "I wanted to see you face to face," the man continued. "I know I can't take back what I did. I've had a lot of time to think about it. I lost everything I thought mattered, but maybe that's what I needed to finally learn what respect really means." He extended the envelope. "This isn't much, but it's a letter. A letter of apology. I didn't send it before because I wanted to say it myself." The director took it gently, nodding. "Thank you." he said simply. The man looked down. You didn't have to forgive me, but I wanted you to know I'm trying to be better. I've been volunteering with kids, teaching them how to stay safe, how to trust again. I guess I'm trying to fix things in my own way. The director's expression softened. That's a good start, he said quietly. What matters isn't what happened, it's what you do next. The man nodded slowly, relief in his eyes. I appreciate you saying that. And I'm sorry for everything. They stood there for a long moment in silence. Two men who had once stood on opposite sides of a terrible misunderstanding, now sharing the same ground. As the man walked away, the director opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note that read, You taught me that power without humility means nothing. Thank you for handling a bad situation with grace. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to live up to the lesson you gave me. He folded the note carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. For a long time, he just stood there staring at the sunset. It was strange, he thought, how forgiveness could heal more deeply than punishment ever could. That night, back in his office, he sat by the window with the lights dimmed. The city glowed outside, alive and breathing. He thought about how much had changed, not just in the department, but in himself. The anger that had once tempted him never won. Instead, patience and decency had turned an injustice into an example of growth. He whispered to himself, Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight inside our own hearts. In the months that followed, the changes he'd helped begin continued to spread. More departments adopted empathy-based training. The academy made human connection a core part of their lessons. Young recruits were taught not only how to enforce the law, but how to understand it in real life, how to see the people behind the situations. The director became something of a quiet mentor to many. He never sought attention, never used his story for fame. Whenever people asked how he managed to stay calm that day, he would smile and say, Because I knew that the way I reacted would define what happened next. And sometimes calm is the strongest answer you can give. Years later, as he prepared to retire, he cleaned out his office and found the letter from that former officer tucked inside a drawer. He read it once more, feeling the same quiet peace he had that day. Then he placed it inside a folder labeled Lessons Worth Remembering. Before leaving for the last time, he walked through the halls of the academy, where new recruits were training. He stopped to watch a young officer practicing a routine traffic stop. The instructor reminded them, Remember, every person you meet could be someone important, but treat them that way even if they aren't. The director smiled. That was the real legacy. As he stepped outside into the soft evening air, he looked back one last time at the building. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was better, and that was enough. He walked slowly toward his car, the same road where it had all started so long ago, now just a quiet memory. The sunset spread warm light across the pavement, and he felt a deep sense of closure. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment, it's about what we learn, how we grow, and how we treat people when no one's watching. And in that moment, with the world calm around him, he knew one thing for certain, that small acts of grace can change everything.